Delta, the Group N cars are slightly less formidable. Nevertheless, Gustavo Trelle's car is to the new specification with slightly better handling and with all the extra torque and marginally more power of the 16-valve engine. After its debut victory on the San Remo Rally, all the drivers who experienced the 16-valve said it was the torque which made the difference rather than the power, just a little bit more pulling power in the mid-ranges, and that made a world of difference to the car. Externally and internally to the driver, there's no visible difference, but it remains to be seen whether the new car can score its victory in Group N here on the Ivory Coast. So, with all the pomp and circumstance which the Ivory Coast can muster for occasions of this nature, with the band playing and with the flags flying, ahead of him and the rest of the competitors, 4 grueling days covering some 3,538 kilometres. There are 4 legs to the event, and legs 3 and 4 are expected to be the difficult ones. As has become traditional with these events, the first is a super special stage. And the flag lifts on the start of the 21st Ivory Coast Rally. Alain Ambrosino, first man off the ramp and away to the super special stage. Behind him, the Mitsubishi Starion of Patrick Tosiak. It's the same car used by Lassie Lampe 2 years ago when he was Middle East Group A champion. And Tosiak said, "I'm not here to win. The only thing I've been told to do is be national champion again." One of the top-run lanciers, this is Pascal Gabin. Gabin has had a terrible season this year and felt the reliability of the 8-valve car was preferable to the extra power of the new 16-valve. And reliability is to become very much a feature of the 21st Ivory Coast. These 3 were the first of no fewer than 60 cars who started the event, the highest number since it was included on the World Rally Championship calendar. And some of the names on the start list are vaguely surprising. They include Jacques Aïta, the French rallycross expert, and a 76-year-old French restaurant owner who once let Sterling Moss drive his Mercedes on the Tour de France. Unsurprisingly, the list of finishers is expected to be far shorter than the list of starters. Nevertheless, 60 cars began the opening super special stage held over the tight and sandy turns of a Renault 4 rallycross track. Although even here, there are the first signs of the water, which is so much a feature of the Ivory Coast. And as a consequence of the water, there's mud too, which has a role to play on the rally, blocking radiators, making life difficult for the service crews. It's difficult to drive in, of course, but it's even more difficult to wear. Mud, however, is not the only natural hazard the drivers will have to face in the coming days. When the weather's dry, the problem is dust, and good stage times with a good position on the road can be a major benefit. Some of the gravel sections which lie ahead are especially daunting as well, and most of the competitors are dreading the Thai forest. Rudy Stoll knows the Ivory Coast very well. He retired from last year's event here with a broken arm after a heavy roll in his Audi Quattro. With a little more support than the privateer entrants, Audi Europe enter their Group A Quattro 90 for number 5 seed Paola De Martini. She's the second highest seeded Quattro driver on the event, and the third representative of what used to be an all-conquering breed in the World Rally Championship is the Italian driver Cin. Like Rudy Stoll, another private entrant. Despite the puddling left over from earlier bad weather, most of the first day's super special stage is over light sandy soil, and here the four-wheel drive cars show their advantage very well. The extra traction on corners and the sheer straight line pulling power is almost visibly evident. On stages like this, the pull of four-wheel drive is worth many seconds advantage. Paola De Martini covering mixed surfaces from mud to dry dust with comparative ease. Behind her, the Italian driver Chin in his Quattro 90. The same technique, but not sounding as strong already. And taking this special stage very slowly indeed. And in fact, Chin already having problems with the cam belt tensioner on the Audi, and that's going to slow him down during the course of the day. No such difficulties for Austrian Rudi Stoll though, and his unflurried technique making good time on this early stage. But traction isn't everything. It carries a weight penalty, of course, and the lighter two-wheel drive cars like the Renault 5 Turbo of Alan Array could use that to their advantage. Even though it's his first time on the Ivory Coast, nor is he the highest seeded driver in Group N, Array could well clinch the world title on this event, as well as claim a FISA priority seeding, like Gustavo Trellis here. A good result would get him a priority seeding as well. Someone else with honour as well as seeding at stake is Grégoire de Mervius, also here on the Ivory Coast for the first time. And he must remember that Pascal Gabon, Group N driver as well, finished second last year on his very first outing. Grégoire de Mervius then number 11. Number 12 is the second 323 entered by Mazda for another Belgian crew, Didier Monin and Manuel Targez. Number 14 is the Volkswagen Golf GTI of Alain Oudit, a privateer French entrant. And number 15, the similar entry of the brothers Michel and Marc Moliny. Number 16 is the French-entered Toyota Corolla of Bernard Decombe and Christian Gruvel, also privateers. And starting 17th is the first of the four-wheel drive Celica GT4s in the hands of Patrick Copetti. Although watching his driving technique, it looked more in the elbows of Patrick Copetti. Behind him comes Assef in its virtual twin, and this is his first drive in the Celica GT4. Number 19, the privately entered Mazda 323 of Mafal. And once again, you can see how hard the driver's working inside. Just a week after the African Championship Rally, Billy Rautenbach brought his spare Supra Turbo to the Ivory Coast. Well down the list of starters, at 23 with a Toyota Corolla, the Belgian driver Jean-Pierre Van der Waal, widely and far more easily known as JP. And then down at number 25 comes the third Top Run Lancia Delta Integrale. This one's in the hands of Swedish driver Fredrik Skognag. All of the 60 starters completed the first day's super special stage, although there were one or two moments and one or two hesitations. The leaders all went through without difficulty, Rudi Stoll being the fastest, just 8 seconds ahead of Paola De Martini, 10 seconds in front of the Nissan of Ambrosino, and the Renault 5 Turbo of Alain Array tied 4th place with De Mervius, Copetti and Skognag, 15 seconds down on the leader. The first session into the bush started at 7 the following morning. The roads were reasonably dry, although the season the locals call the short rains had finished only 2 days earlier, and parts of the route had actually been impassable during the recce due to the volume of standing water. Ambrosino snatched the lead early in the day after a good start through the opening super special stage and held it for some time. Patrick Tosiak went missing almost straight away after the first stage and was held up by a fuel injection problem. Pascal Gabon in the Integrale was having problems already with intercom and with a torn driveshaft gaiter. And Rudi Stoll was beginning to lose his overnight lead almost at once, dropping steadily backwards through the field. Paola De Martini also shared his experience. The Quattro's not really handy enough in these conditions. Behind in her dust came the third of the Quattro 90s, the Italian driver Chin, already slowed by some 6 minutes with water pump problems. Number 8, the Group A Toyota Corolla of Adolphe Chateau and Jean-Pierre Claverie. The French pair already running strongly and showing promise of a good finish. Things weren't going particularly well for all the drivers though, and already this early in the rally problems were beginning to develop. Next on the road, Gustavo Trellis, having problems now which would require a left front drive shaft to be fitted later in the day. Behind him, the Belgian Grégoire de Mervius, and his trip meter is already starting to play him up and make life more difficult than it has to be. Although there aren't the number of spectators on the Ivory Coast, enthusiasm is always a feature. Ambrosino held on to the lead. His co-driver here, Dessau, was one of the people who thought the previous year's event had been too easy and was therefore partly responsible for the rough stuff yet to come. Both of them must have known that behind them, last year's runner-up Pascal Gabon was closing fast. Nevertheless, Daniel Dessau and the driver, Ambrosini, appeared cool and confident. And certainly their Nissan 200 giving no cause for concern. Last year's winner, the #1 seed. And perhaps with Patrick Tosiak still not heard of, he has every reason to be confident. Of course, communications are not as easy on the Ivory Coast as they are on some of the European venues, and what is not known yet is the fate of Patrick Tosiak, whether or not he's still a runner or whether he's out of the rally. Certainly Ambrosino still confident, even though he knows that Pascal Gabon is catching him up. And there the sign of the abysmal weather, which abated only a couple of days before the start of the event. Gabon, though, in the top run Lancia, close behind at the time control. Again, no outward signs of the problems inside. And the Lancia apparently going very strongly indeed. However, the conditions on the Ivory Coast are the enemy. Very, very rutted, hard roads and then straight into the puddles. And despite the earlier reconnaissance, the drivers having to negotiate some sections of the route with considerable caution. Already, though, the conditions are beginning to take their toll, and the field of 60 beginning to be reduced. For one reason or another, natural hazards eliminate some of the drivers, but there are also the mechanical problems as well. Rudi Stoll here, slipping backwards through the field and almost certainly unaware of the problem developing under the hood of his Audi Quattro. Using the power and traction to good advantage and dealing with some of these very impressive gravel sections as well as the puddles. But it's the depth of those puddles and the unknown depth of them which constitutes the major natural hazard. Paolo Di Martini at the time control, still in touch with Rudi Stoll and with the leaders, although as these roads start to show more and more signs of the recent rain and tend to bear out local newspaper reports that some parts of the route ahead are still underwater, she found out exactly what a hazard those deep puddles really can be. No problem going round the edges of the deeper ones. And And you can see it's up to the wheel arches on the Quattro. And as long as there's some firm edge, no problem. But here, where there is no alternative but to go through the centre, even the four-wheel drive Quattro is stalled in the mud. Engine still running, but not going anywhere. Alain Arey to run through on his own. It had taken some pressure on Edmund Simon, who prepares the car, before he finally allowed Alain Arey to enter. He said the roads are better this year, even though the Renault 5 hadn't been developed for gravel roads until halfway through the 1989 season. Even the team manager said that they hadn't thought of winning, and all they tried to do was keep the car running as long as possible, and for that reason they changed parts for security at every opportunity. They also ran the car as light as possible. It only does about 9 miles to the gallon, and they refueled as often as they could and never loaded more than 42 litres, about 10 gallons on board. So if Alain Arey had missed one rendezvous point with his service team, he would have been out of the rally. Arey himself, of course, was taking things very steadily indeed, obviously mindful of the fact that a good finish could secure him the title and relieve him of the problem of having to fight it out on the RAC, while a big off could lose it. So he was pacing himself very carefully from the start right the way through to the finish and taking no chances with the big puddles. Like the other drivers before him, he picks his way round the edges, but here he has no choice but to go straight into the middle of the puddle that claimed Paolo De Martini, but the Renault 5 digs its way through and keeps on going. Behind him are the other two contenders for the Group N World title. Number 11 here is Grégoire de Mervius in the Mazda. And de Mervius has passed number 10, Gustavo Trelles, and is closing now on Alain Arey. His self-restraint here, taking things easily and picking his way round the edges of the puddles wherever he can, is a sign to the control of the driver, because the world title is within his reach if he can pass the car in front of him. He gets through the big puddle that's caused all the problems with no difficulty, over the ruts and then away on the gravel. De Mervius has already passed Rudi Stoll, and now Gustavo Trelles passes Stoll as well and moves up another place as the Austrian-entered Quattro slips further and further down the field. And in fact, Rudi Stoll on his way out of the rally and retiring very, very shortly. Meanwhile, Trelles arrives at the puddle hazard, takes it a little bit quicker than Grégoire de Mervius. Bounces it over the ruts and away on the gravel. But later on, near the control point at Keichi, he plunged straight in, got stuck in the mud, and you can see all four wheels kicking up spray there. And is now well and truly sunk in, despite the fact that there is no shortage of helping hands and no shortage of people willing to dig. The top run Lancia well and truly entrenched, and it took a tow rope and 15 minutes to clear it from the mud. That wasn't the end of his problems though, and he retired soon afterwards with a damaged differential. Meanwhile, a fire under the bonnet had put Rudi Stoll out, and then leader Alain Ambrosino went out after a collision with a service barge. Just 25 of the 60 starters finished day one, with Pascal Gabon the leader and Alain Arey second. But by the end of the next day, an overheating problem had slowed Gabon and dropped him down into 5th position.
I have more problem in the tie. I have when I begin tie, I am leading with 1 minute for Arey, and I have problem with the radiator. The tube is broke, and I put water, but it's a long way, and the assistants arrive and we change. But after 10 kilometers, we broke semi-aft, cardan, and again I lost 2 hours.
The new leader was Belgian driver JP van der Waar with a 15-minute lead. He was confident at the start of the next day, but not overly so, and said, "I must just drive steadily and see what happens." Although the previous day he'd been involved in a tussle for the lead and produced some brilliant driving to stay out in front. Still holding second place, Alan Array was the man JP had been struggling against. Then Array had been slowed by overheating problems, though his were caused by mud blocking the radiator. He'd stopped to clear it and then taken the rest of the day steadily to avoid damaging an overheated and overheating engine. Freshly serviced, he set off to recommence the previous day's duel with Van der Waar, in which he'd lost, regained and lost the lead from the Toyota. Pascal Gabin had finished second on this rally last year and been the first Group N car ever to lead a World Championship rally. Alan Array must have been thinking about winning, but more so thinking about finishing and his world title in Group N. Also closing in was Pascal Gabin, but his challenge was short-lived. He was stuck for 40 minutes in the water which had claimed the Lancia of Gustavo Trelles, and after he got free, the cam belt broke and he was forced to retire. That meant that behind him, car number 25, Frédéric Skognac, was the sole surviving member of the top run team and still looked strong for a good finish. Paola De Martini in the Quattro was on her way out of the rally, the engine eventually dying quietly by the roadside. And Grégoire de Mervius too was not long for the leaderboard. He half rolled the Mazda into a muddy puddle and retired, virtually handing the Group N title to Alan Array, providing the Renault could finish. By now, the rate of attrition had become fairly horrifying, and very, very few of the original 60 starters were left, with more falling by the wayside every minute. In view of the high proportion of privateer entrants and the fact that there was very little in the way of factory support, that's not an entirely unexpected situation. Perhaps what was unexpected was that one of the fallers should be the last of the top-run Lanciers. Frédéric Skognac out of the Ivory Coast Rally. Out in front of the Ivory Coast Rally, Van der Waar still leads. No sign of problems with the Toyota Corolla, and no sign of a real challenge. At one stage his lead extended to some 70 minutes. Somewhere behind him, Patrick Tosiak is closing up through the diminishing field almost by virtue of survival. But with such a lead, it looks as though victory was settled for the Toyota. Even a minor collision which damaged the light assembly with a small animal, a goat in this case, seemed not to worry JP.
Crash in the chèvre, in the little animal.
He seemed also unworried that his Toyota had missed service overnight, even though everybody agreed beforehand that preparation was a major factor of the Ivory Coast Rally. Nevertheless, with the finish virtually in sight, he still had a 16-minute lead over the second-place Renault of Alan Array. And Array, who needed only to finish to collect his world title, perhaps wasn't pushing too hard. Unlike Patrick Tosiak, pushing as hard as he can go in the Mitsubishi. This is Alan Array, though, in second place. And all that precautionary service worked out. He confirms that he has no problems with the Simon Racing Renault 5 Turbo. Tosiak by now was third on the road with just 8 cars left in contention, and he looked as though his earlier misfortunes were all behind him, though he said he was taking no chances.
How are things going?
What?
How are things going?
Yes, I think.
I go slowly now. The car is very rough.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Good luck.
I go slowly now. But up ahead of him, disaster for the leader. A complete engine failure put Jean-Pierre's Toyota on the end of a rope and out of the Ivory Coast Rally. And that put Alain Array with the Group N Renault 5 in the lead. The only threat now to the first ever victory by a Group N car could have come from Patrick Tosiak. But the fuel injection problem which held him up on the second day of the rally returned, and he spent over 30 minutes by the side of the road until it was fixed.